Hello, everyone. Welcome to Scottsdale 360, a virtual learning series focusing on the people, policies, and programs that shape our city government and the community we serve. Hi, I'm Christy Hill, your host today for Pinnacle Peak History. Thank you for joining us. I promise you won't be disappointed. Scottsdale historian Joan Fudala will present a photo-rich history of what is the geographic center of Scottsdale. Can you believe that? Pinnacle Peak is the geographic center of Scottsdale. That one's a hard one to wrap your head around. I just want to give special thanks to Rawhide and Bruce Wall, who are our gentlemen working behind the scenes to make sure that this virtual class can actually occur. And they have silently in the background designed and coordinated the framework of the class. And without them, it just wouldn't go. So their work makes your experience out there in the audience feel smooth and seamless, and I'm grateful too. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Joan. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for everyone participating today. Whether you live in the Pinnacle Peak area, whether you're a longtime resident or a new person, I hope that you've found many reasons to enjoy the area around the Pinnacle Peak landmark itself, whether it's a great place to live, play golf, take a hike, picnic, go to the restaurants and shops that are around there. There's so many things to do in the greater Pinnacle Peak area. But I think learning a little bit about the backstory and some of the colorful characters that have created that area and made their mark in history is just as fun as the things that we can do in the greater Pinnacle Peak area today. Me personally, I was, as I mentioned just a moment ago, I am an Air Force veteran and I was a public affairs officer stationed at Luke Air Force Base in 1976. And that was when the greater Pinnacle Peak area was very sparsely populated, but we would often charter a bus to go all the way from Luke Air Force Base across the valley before freeways made it a lot more convenient. And we'd have squadron parties up at the old Reata Pass and Pinnacle Peak restaurants. And in fact, my husband and I announced our engagement in the summer of 1976 at Reata Pass. And I guess because our love story started there, we always wanted to come back and actually lived in the Pinnacle Peak area starting in 1991 after our Air Force and other career moves brought us back here to Arizona. But enough about me. While we have this photo of Pinnacle Peak itself up on the screen, probably the best place to start would be the geological history of the peak itself. Thanks to the late Dr. Troy Payway, a geology professor at ASU, who decades ago did some studies of not only Pinnacle Peak, but the McDowell Mountains and their geology. He first wanted to point out that although it looks like a volcano, it's not a volcano. It's actually camelback, coarse, grained granite that has been chemically weathered and erosion over millennia and literally millions of years. It's 3,170 feet above sea level. And it was formed, according to the geologists, about 1 million to 2 million years ago, due to this chemical weathering process of the granite there. And the land itself that it was eroded from, geologists peg to be about 1.7 to 1.8 billion with a B years old. So a lot of geological history that created this wonderful landmark for Scottsdale. So I guess now that we know about the peak itself, let's talk a little bit about the area around it. I love this old map. So as we define the greater Pinnacle Peak area, let's look at this map that was an ad for Pinnacle Peak Patio in the 1958 Scottsdale High School yearbook. You could see from the zigzag route to get up there what Pinnacle Peak area, again, very sparsely populated in the 1950s looked like. But basically, for the purpose of this talk and the purpose of talking about the greater Pinnacle Peak area, to the north, it goes as far as what we now know as Brown's Ranch, or that part of the McDowell Sonoran Preserve today, a little bit past Dynamite Boulevard. It goes east to Rio Verde along Dynamite Boulevard and maybe a little north of that. It goes south as far as Thompson Peak Parkway, so includes a little bit of DC Ranch, and it goes west all the way to Scottsdale Road, and certainly includes, as you can see, kind of on the left-hand side, about midway on the map, there's a place called Curry's Corner, which is the intersection of Scottsdale Road and Pinnacle Peak, and I'll talk to you in a few minutes about why that was called Curry's Corner, but that was one of the few things that landmarks in addition to Pinnacle Peak that existed way back when. Well, although the geology and the geographical area is important, it's really the people that have created the history of Pinnacle Peak area. And our human history goes back almost 8,000 years. Archaeologists, in doing studies around the greater Pinnacle Peak area, found evidence, particularly in the Browns Mountain area, that archaic people came through the area as hunters and gatherers as much as almost 8,000 years ago, and they left behind things, they're called projectile points, which are on the man's hand on the left side of the screen. But they're back in Ohio, where I grew up, we used to call those arrowheads. Anyway, there were artifacts of the archaic people that show that they were probably the first humans that we're aware of that were in the greater Pinnacle Peak area. But later on, in the 60s through the 1980s, as more development happened, we found that it was actually a village very near Pinnacle Peak itself of Hohokam people. Now, we know the Hohokam were in the southern part of Scottsdale and dug canals off of the Salt River and farmed in the area of the what we now know as Southern Scottsdale. But it wasn't really until the last 60 years or so that we knew that there was a separate group of Hohokam that lived in the McDowells, but more particularly near Pinnacle Peak. And there were some seasonal mountain springs that gave them water so that they could also raise crops. But they created a village of upland Hohokam people. And particularly in the mid to late 1980s, when part of Troon Village was being developed, Desert Crest and some of the other subdivisions in Troon. Can you imagine the look on the backhoe operator's face when he was using the backhoe to dig the sewer lines, and some of the artifacts that you see in that poster in the middle of the screen rain down from the backhoe shovel? So fortunately, that area was being developed by very environmentally and historically conscious developers, Jerry Nelson and his wife Florence. And so they stopped development and invited in archaeologists from ASU, as well as from the Desert Foothills chapter of the Arizona Archaeological Society. And they began digging in the area and also helping excavate pit homes, which were what the Hohokam were living in at the time. And again, it really gave us a picture of those early inhabitants of the greater Pinnacle Peak area. We also know that later on, and the upland Hohokam people began to disappear and move elsewhere in about 1200 BC, or excuse me, what we used to call AD, but now it's the common area, CE, about 1200. And then Yavapai people also came through that area and later again became the residents of the Fort McDowell area. So speaking of Fort McDowell in our more modern times, the development of this large area of central Arizona was really began to occur after the Civil War. And Major General Irvin McDowell, who at the time was commander of all the armies of the Pacific based in San Francisco, authorized development of camp named after him. I don't think he picked the name. I think others picked the name after him. But it was built in 1865, right after the Civil War, to help protect early settlers and explorers that were coming out here using some of their veterans benefits and looking for opportunities in the central Arizona area, which again, other than of course the Native American populations, was not really developed or settled at all. Uh, Irvin McDowell visited in February of 1866 and was appalled to see that the soldiers at Camp McDowell, Fort McDowell, were spending more time growing crops to feed themselves and their horses than they were at soldiering. So he found some Civil War veterans that would create a hay camp to feed Fort McDowell and its residents. And that hay camp on the Salt River became the beginnings of the town of Phoenix. And so if you can imagine the hay camp operators taking the hay and supplies from the small settlement of Phoenix up to Camp McDowell, Fort McDowell, they would have had to go right through the greater Pinnacle Peak area en route. Also, there was a military road called the Stoneman Road that was built between Camp McDowell and the Camp Fort Whipple in Prescott. And that there are still vestiges of that road that go through part of the greater Pinnacle Peak area. And that's a fascinating story. Google it and you'll find a lot of information that was done by members of the McDowell Sonoran Conservancy's Pathfinder group in their great research about the Stoneman Road. So again, putting us in context of the greater Scottsdale area and how Pinnacle Peak history fits into that. As many of you may know, we were founded as a farming and ranching community by Army Chaplain Winfield Scott and Helen in 1888. And really, we stayed a farming and ranching community for the first 6 decades of our existence. We know that although the central part of that farming and ranching community is the area we now know as Old Town Scottsdale, and Pinnacle Peak was some 20 miles north of that small farming settlement, there were a few hardy souls that ventured north, and also there were some miners that were trying to do claims out of the settlement of Cave Creek and what we now know as the Carefree area, a little north of the Pinnacle Peak area. And one of the first settlers that we know that came to what we now know as the DC Ranch area in the McDowells was a man named Frank Frazier and his wife Mitty. And they created a homestead in the McDowells, again in a part now of DC Ranch. They got water from Fraser Springs, and they actually hosted a campout Thanksgiving weekend of 1906 of several of the residents of Old Town Scottsdale. There's a wonderful account of it in a 1906 edition of the Arizona Republican newspaper that describes what that was like. Then, of course, as I mentioned, because we are a farming community, a huge cattle ranch was established in 1916 by E.O. Brown and partners. And at its very peak, it encompassed the Pinnacle Peak area, went as far north as Brown's Ranch, named for E.O. Brown, which was the northern part of the ranch, all the way down. So that went all the way up, way past Dynamite, all the way south to what we now know as Bell Road, and encompassed what we now know as DC Ranch, which was also part of E.O. Brown's empire, if you will, cattle empire. 44,000 acres of cattle ranching, and with authentic cowboys and ranch hands, and really which gave us our authentic Western cowboy, if you will, and cattle ranching history, and certainly was a precursor to us adopting the slogan after World War II of the westmost Western town. E.O. And his partners, as well as his sons, his eldest son, E.E. Brownie Brown, held at least semi-annual cattle cattle drives going from the Browns Ranch and DC Ranch south through the Pinnacle Peak area. Had a way station where they spent one night around what we now know as Shea and the 101, and then continued on to the stockyards, which were located fairly close to what we now know as Sky Harbor Airport. And then in the reverse way, they would take new cattle that had been delivered by rail up from Mexico, and they would drive the cattle back up to the ranch, raise the cattle, and then do the reverse process during the next cattle drive. So that, again, as I mentioned, was our authentic cattle and cowboy history. But believe it or not, around those big cattle ranches, there were also sheep ranches and there were sheep drives as well. Not quite as many as the cattle drive, but that was, again, an important part of our early history of the greater Pinnacle Peak area. And as I mentioned, the biggest ranch, the Browns Ranch, DC Ranch, 44,000 acres, was established in 1916. But by the 1950s, ranching had really started tapering off, and more people were finding a reason to live in the greater Pinnacle Peak area. So homesteading in that area began to take off in the 1930s. One of the most well-known homesteaders was a Phoenix lawyer and World War I veteran named K.T. Palmer. And if that name sounds familiar to you, he and Tom Darlington and Les Ruart have been known as the co-founders of the town of Carefree, just north of the Pinnacle Peak area. But in 1933, he was out on a Sunday drive with his children at the time, and they were giving his wife Betty the afternoon off, and he took his car at the time across a bare desert from Phoenix all the way to Pinnacle Peak. It was beautiful springtime. The flowers and the cacti were in bloom, and although there weren't any roads really at the time, he just fell in love with that area. And I don't know how he did it. He must have been very charismatic, but he convinced Betty, his wife, and their two children at the time, they had a third child later, to move lock, stock, and barrel and live at the north base of Pinnacle Peak Mountain. Again, no running water, no telephone, no electrical service, and just a rustic, simple way of life. Interestingly, he had a few neighbors. The Ochoa family had a small ranch. The Demerby family had a small ranch in the area. A man named Joe Yusko also had a ranch. And during the time that K.T. Palmer lived there, he hired Oliver Halfley to help build his house and develop the area. He wrote a wonderful book called For Land's Sake. It's been out of print for many years, but I think there's a copy in the Scottsdale Heritage Connection Room at the Civic Center Library. It's a wonderful read. It's a memoir of how they settled in that area. But two of my favorite stories from the book is that Betty, because there was no one else around, felt safe enough to, after a rainstorm, when some of the metates that had been used by the Hohokam to grind their agave created almost a natural bathtub. And so when rainwater filled that up, she would actually climb up on a rock that had that metate built into it and take a bath in that depression in a rock. But the other favorite story, and as you can see in the photo on the right, that's Deljean and Alan, two of KT and Betty's children, with rattlesnakes at their feet and a red racer snake in Deljean's hands. They had a lot of rattlesnakes on their property because, again, they had settled in the middle of raw desert. So KT would, in trying to keep his family safe, would gather up the snakes after he got home from work from his law firm in Phoenix, put him in a burlap sack and throw him in the trunk of his car. And then the next morning, with the snakes in the trunk, would actually drive his kids and the one or two other children that were living that area down into Scottsdale so that they could go to Scottsdale Elementary and High School. And then on his way to his law firm in Phoenix, would stop by an old place called the Reptile Garden that was a kind of a shack along Van Buren Avenue, drop off the snakes and sometimes a Gila monster or two, and then continue on to work. And I don't know about you, but I would not want to get into a car that I knew had rattlesnakes in the trunk. Another story that K.T. Palmer told about those early days is that another landowner named Clyde Pierce owned some land around what we now know as Pinnacle Peak and Pima Roads, and they had a handshake deal where KT would have dibs on buying land that was north of Pinnacle Peak Road, which was just a gravel track at the time, and Clyde Pierce would have dibs on buying land that was available south of Pinnacle Peak Road. And in order to trade some land that already was owned by Clyde Pierce, they traded a bedroom set of furniture for the land. So that's what the land in that area was worth at that particular time frame. Life, as I said, in the greater Pinnacle Peak area in the 30s and 40s was still very third worldish. Another person who owned land in that area was J.B. Curry, or John Curry. And he had homesteaded land at the corner of what we now know as Scottsdale and Pinnacle Peak Road in the 1930s. And he and a couple of landowners then graded, but didn't pave, just put gravel down on the first iteration of Pinnacle Peak Road from basically what was then unpaved Scottsdale Road all the way to Boulder Mountain, which is now, of course, known as Troon Mountain. And that gave a little bit of unpaved access to the Pinnacle Peak area. But JB also was a speculator. He created at that corner a small grocery store and put in a gas pump, and also allowed a first kind of trailer court to be developed there. Another site that became a little bit more common in the area as a few more people came in, as obviously people needed water. So that structure that you see in the bottom center of the screen was called a Punch and Judy, and that was a water drilling apparatus that was owned by Gabe Brooks, who was known as the water wizard in those days, that tried to drill water wells for the ranches and homesteads that were located in the greater Pinnacle Peak area. And two of his employees were high schoolers at the time, Malcolm White, who later, as I said, was an instructor at Thunderbird 2 airfield during World War II, and then became Scottsdale's first mayor after we incorporated in 1951. And his companion, who also worked for Gabe Brooks to drill water, was none other than George Doc Cavalier, who later, of course, ran for city council and also, was the proprietor of Reata Pass and Greasewood Flat. They both talked about how scary it was that they, because of their small size at the time, being high schoolers, were lowered in a bucket to every time the drill drilled further down into the ground so that they could see if water was struck yet. And they said it was not for someone that had any type of claustrophobia. And for those people who remember that we did have Thunderbird Field as a pilot training base long before Scottsdale Airport occupied that land. The pilot training base operated from 1942 to 1944. And perhaps back in the background, you can just barely see Pinnacle Peak Mountain. And the pilots, most of them, of course, have since passed away. But the pilot trainees and people that worked at the airfield said that Pinnacle Peak became a very important navigational landmark for those early early pilots. Again, this was basic pilot training for those who had never flown before. They were flying bi-wing steermen, and they had no instruments other than an altimeter and an airspeed indicator. And so they would always fly during good weather. But again, as they were learning how to navigate, Pinnacle Peak became a really important part of their training so that they could find their way back to land on the, again, unpaved landing strip there at Thunderbird 2 Airfield. So after World War II, as more people had been discovering Scottsdale, having been either stationed here or worked in war industries during World War II, we needed to have some places for visitors and new residents to stay. So there were a few early tourism areas up in the greater Pinnacle Peak area. In the late 1940s, George Ellis, who with his wife Rachel had established the cattle track area, an artist enclave off of Scottsdale and McDonald Roads. He had designed a number of homes, not only at cattle track, but also in the lower part of Scottsdale. And so he was hired by a woman named Lois Kellogg Mowry in the late 1940s to build a home for her at the base of Pinnacle Peak. And that she gave the name of her new home to be Crescent Moon Ranch. She also had a few outbuildings on the property and rented those out to seasonal residents, again, as a guest ranch. She was interesting too, and also hosted holiday parties during December for underprivileged children, as they were called at the time, doling out gifts and giving them a kind of a ranch experience for a day. She sold the property and it eventually was acquired by the Ingebrigtsen family, who lived there off and on. And just recently, during a talk about local architecture, I met a man named Fred Corbus. He might be listening today. And he told me that for a while he was having architect Ned Sawyer build a beautiful modern home for him very near Pinnacle Peak, he and his family lived in the Ingebrigtsen house in Crescent Moon Ranch. Another interesting story about Crescent Moon Ranch is just a few years before, well, actually, it was about 10 years before it was torn down for the development of the Four Seasons Resort, which is now located at that site. Crescent Moon Ranch provided the stage set for the film Raising Arizona, which was filmed there in 1987. And so that put that particular property, although it was never named that, on the map. Most of the interior scenes with Nicolas Cage and the baby were filmed inside. Another guest ranch opened at the corner of Pinnacle Peak and Pima Road in 1950 on the property of J. Clyde Pierce and run by his daughter and son-in-law, the Puntennies. Rancho Vista Bonita was such a deal in 1950 when it opened and advertised in the Scottsdale Progress newspaper. It said that you got a cottage, you got 3 meals a day, you got access to a horse for horseback riding, and all this for the princely sum of $10 or $12.50 a day. So that was a popular place to come and have a wonderful, almost dude ranch experience. It operated from about 1950 to 1961. And also years ago, Craig Jackson told me that his parents, Russ and Nellie Jackson, the co-founders of the Barrett Jackson Auto Auction, used to come out from Michigan and have winter holidays at Rancho Vista Bonita. Jerry and Florence Nelson bought the property in 1969, 1970, and actually used the cottages and the main building at Rancho Vista Bonita for their base of headquarters, not only for their own family, but the families of the construction crews that were building Pinnacle Peak Village. For some of the old timers that might be listening, perhaps you remember taking a family outing on a Sunday afternoon to go to Don Pablo's House of Relics that was located at the corner of Scottsdale Road and Pinnacle Peak Road. Don Pablo was quite an interesting and colorful character. He moved out here sometime probably in the 40s from Michigan. His real name was Paul Volcker, from a fairly well-known family in Michigan. But he came out, established a curio shop in the main part of Old Town Scottsdale. But he had a monkey, and that the monkey wasn't very hygienic, I guess. And some of the merchants that were attracting new tourists and residents to their shops in Old Town objected to the odor coming from the monkey. So they suggested that he would have a lot more space for his curios if he moved north. So he took them at their suggestion and he moved up to that corner. And from the 1950s through the 1960s and early 1970s, he had a fabulous collection of things that he reclaimed from the desert, old branding irons and flat irons and other ranching implements. He found something that would probably be illegal today, but relics from the Native Americans that have been living in the area, pottery and other relics. He had a kachina collection. He had all kinds of antiques. And again, it was quite the place where families that love to explore his collections and perhaps buy something. Don Pablo, after he owned that corner, had some other ideas. He actually went to the Maricopa County Planning Commission, because that was still county property at the time, and tried to get a motorcycle racetrack operated there. And there was also some talk of building a mosque on the property. And that, of course, is the corner that we now know is a Safeway store and other restaurants and area right there on the corner of Scottsdale and Pinnacle Peak Road. Well, as you can imagine, because the landscape is so beautiful around the Pinnacle Peak area, it attracted artists in the 1940s, and they were some of the early residents that were so inspired by not only the landscape, but the animals and the bird life. For example, Walter Bowl and his wife Annie came out from Wisconsin, and they lived on the base of, they had a trailer that they actually lived first at Curry's Corner. I neglected to mention that one of the early settlements there before we had permanent guest ranches was a trailer park named Livingston Trailer Park at the corner of Scottsdale and Pinnacle Peak Road. But after a few years wintering there, they moved their trailer to the south side of Pinnacle Peak and then eventually built a house there. He had started his career in Wisconsin and the Chicago area, was actually an exhibitor at the World's Fair in the 1930s, and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt bought some of his artwork. He created the 1943 Federal Migratory Bird Stamp of wood ducks. Which is now a very collectible item. And he also was an illustrator for Esquire magazine, specializing in all types of bird art, of ducks and all kinds of other avian subjects. But he then started chronicling through his woodcuts and his pen and ink drawings of the many types of birds, roadrunners and Gamba quail and others that he was finding on their property, living there at the base of Pinnacle Peak. And Annie, his wife, was a very talented writer and oftentimes chronicled not only her husband Walter's art, but also what life was like living in the desolate area of Pinnacle Peak. And many of her articles appeared in the 1950s editions of Arizona Highways magazine. Another couple of artists that were very well known and had lived in just south of Old Town, and then in the area where the Paradise Valley Town Hall is located now, were Matilde Schaefer and Davis and her husband Lou Davis. Lou was a WPA artist who created that wonderful painting of miners in his hometown of Jerome, and also just wonderful oil paintings. Mathilde was a very talented sculptor and ceramicist. That those small ceramic pieces of two shepherds were part of her collection that she created in the Arizona Craftsman Center that opened at Scottsdale, or excuse me, at Main Street and Brown Avenue after World War II. But they felt that they were getting a little crowded in downtown Scottsdale and also even in the town of Paradise Valley. And so in the late 1950s, they moved up to the base of Pinnacle Peak and had their studios there as well as their home, and lived the rest of their lives there. And after they both passed away in the 1970s, they actually had their ashes scattered on the mountain that's just that little hill that when you're facing from the south, Pinnacle Peak. It's a mound to the west of Pinnacle Peak Mountain. And at one point, a couple of years ago, the city was thinking about giving it a name, and that never panned out. I suggested it be Davis Mountain since their ashes are scattered there. But again, Lou and Mathilde Schaefer Davis were definitely important artists that lived in the Pinnacle Peak area, and as was Navajo artist Andy Sinigine. Again, he migrated to the Scottsdale area after serving in World War II. He again was part of the Arizona Craftsmen that worked in downtown Scottsdale after World War II, and then moved up and lived in a hogan on K.T. Palmer's property on the north side of Pinnacle Peak. And he created beautiful murals that decorated a lot of early businesses in the 1950s in Old Town Scottsdale. And many of his pieces of art were also snapped up by local museums as they opened around the greater Phoenix area. And he also was a very popular illustrator for articles in Arizona Highways magazine. Well, in addition to those artists I've also mentioned, there were others that migrated to the Pinnacle Peak area. Ed Chernak in the 1950s, a man called Lotan, and no, I didn't stutter. He used both names, first and last. And also Marjorie Thomas. Although she lived in the Old Town area, she came up frequently. And by the way, she was Scottsdale's first artist coming out here in 1909, but she came up often to the Pinnacle Peak area. And of course, for those of us that loved the cowboy restaurants, I have to mention the three that were beloved and now unfortunately have all closed in the last 10 years. Pinnacle Peak Patio opened in 1957, first owned by the Depews, and then for a long time owned by the McElhaney family. Big Marv was the steak cook. Early on, it was a way station for drivers coming from Scottsdale or Phoenix going up to the lakes to fish. And so it was a gas station and a small general store. But as it became a restaurant, famous for its cowboy steaks, huge cowboy steaks, and beans and cornbread, they developed a reputation for being a place that wasn't welcome to fancy dressed city slickers, and anybody that dared to wear a necktie got it ceremoniously cut off by their waitress and then stapled to the ceiling. And by the time they closed 7 or 8 years ago, there were thousands and thousands of ties, many also with a person's business card or a card with their name on it stapled to the ceiling. So I'm sure many of you remember having a tie cut off and stapled to the ceiling. Across the street from Pinnacle Peak Patio, Doc Cavalier and the Cavalier family opened Reata Pass in about 1958. They had a wonderful house band there. The Western Gentleman that played, this is an album of theirs, that played there at Reata Pass, and you could dine outdoors or you could dine indoors. Something that was interesting about the indoor bar area is that during World War II, in order to create some war worker housing, a housing project that was federally funded opened to on Marshall Way and 2nd Street, right where the Museum of the West is now. It was called Thunderbird Homes. And after the war and during the 50s, it served as rental apartments. It was taken down in 1960, and the buildings of Thunderbird Homes were sold off to anybody that wanted to relocate them. So the Cavalier family bought the recreation building of Thunderbird Homes and trucked it up to Reata Pass, and then used it as the bar area inside, which you see in the lower left-hand corner. Doc had served in the Army Air Corps in North Africa during World War II, and he was really impressed by what he saw when some of his outfit had visited the oasis outside of Algiers. And so he always was so impressed with the conviviality and congeniality of these outdoor areas where people could gather and have a good time. And so he fashioned his outdoor restaurant called Greasewood Flats after what he had seen in those oases in Algeria and when he was stationed near Algeria. Many people remember having wonderful times in the all outdoor restaurant called Greasewood Flat. And again, there was country band playing and also dancing, and it was really a wonderful time al fresco. And again, it just closed a few years ago. And maybe some people will also remember for a brief time there was another outdoor restaurant called Dolly's Cook Shack. At the corner of Scottsdale and Pinnacle Peak Road in 1971, a man named Jim Paul, pictured there, opened Rawhide, an authentic Western town. And that operated there through 2005. He had been a very active collector of Western memorabilia. And I'm not just talking about small things. Sometimes he went through Colorado and other Utah and other areas and bought whole ghost towns and actually brought the buildings from those old towns to that corner in North Scottsdale and recreated an authentic 1880s Western town. So many families took outings there, enjoyed stagecoach rides, and recreated Western shootouts. For a long time after Jim Paul sold it, it was owned by Jerry Hirsch and then other owners. Some people may remember several years before it closed, they even recreated a running of the bulls. That was where the Parada del Sol Rodeo was held from the 1980s through 2005. And then when development encroached Rawhide, it moved to the Gila River Indian community. And of course, that whole area where Rawhide used to be is the Silverstone development that we know today. The area finally of Greater Pinnacle Peak was annexed into Scottsdale in 1982, and then further north of Pinnacle Peak was finally annexed in 1984. So when that final annexation took place in 1984, that's when the Greater Pinnacle Peak area became the geographical center of the long and skinny city of Scottsdale, now at 184.5 square miles. And during that time in the early 80s, now that we were officially part of Scottsdale, development began in earnest. And people saw what a wonderful area that would be to live in. Jerry Nelson and Florence had started developing the Pinnacle Peak Village, the general store in the 1970s, and also a golf course. But their big development, Troon Village, then was developed in the mid-80s and beyond. And again, they also developed Troon North in the 1990s. At the same time, Lyle Anderson was developing desert highlands just at the base of Pinnacle Peak. And how lucky we were to have the Nelsons and Lyle Anderson that were all very environmentally oriented and really took new design standards to a higher level in incorporating desert-friendly features, low water, total xeriscaping, very little grass, except on various parts of their golf courses, and very environmentally friendly colors in all of the designs. So again, as the master plan communities were built, new design standards were definitely incorporated into these areas. And as these master plan communities developed, of course, golf was a really important part of that. We had had a very, very rustic golf course in the 1950s and 60s, a 9-hole all dirt layout called Ironwood along Scottsdale Road at Jomax. But the real first very nice golf course opened in 1975, Pinnacle Peak Country Club. Then when Desert Highlands opened in 1983 at the base of Pinnacle Peak, it was designed by Jack Nicholas, and he and Lyle really are recognized as the pioneers of the desert golf concept of golf. And that very year that the golf course opened at Desert Highlands, it hosted the first inaugural skins game pitting Tom Watson, Jack Nicklaus, Gary Player, and Arnold Palmer, the top 4 golfers in the world at the time, in a skins game. And because it was televised on the then new ESPN network, the whole world got to see the beauties of the Pinnacle Peak area. Troon Golf Course has hosted many tournaments over the years. That's then Vice President Dan Quayle playing in a tournament in the 1980s at Troon. And they just recently hosted a USGA women's tournament there. And of course, Troon North, Estancia, and the Golf Club of Scottsdale, now known as Scottsdale National, also give the greater Pinnacle Peak area its great golf reputation. Well, certainly the 1990s through the 2010s were a boom time for the Pinnacle Peak area, with the opening of many amenities to serve the growing number of residents. The AJ's Center and La Mirada, the Four Seasons Resort opened to where Crescent Moon Ranch used to be. Many churches developed: Pinnacle Peak Presbyterian, Highlands, Living Waters, and others. Pinnacle Peak Elementary School opened, retirement communities like Silverstone, and this one that's photographed here is Akoya at Troon. And then where Rawhide used to be, we have the Appaloosa Library, as well as Silverstone and a Sprouts grocery store and others. So again, we've had fine dining and many other amenities, as well as great civic organizations. And along the way, as we've developed, we also got very concerned about preserving the best of the Pinnacle Peak area. Again, we voted to buy the McDowell Mountains and also the Browns Ranch area, and created the McDowell Sonoran Preserve, which now is over 30,000 acres. Thanks to the Nelsons, they donated the land, which is Pinnacle Peak itself. And after many years, it finally became an official city park in April of 2002. So we've done really well in preserving the land, and also through things like the environmentally sensitive land ordinance and the desert plant ordinance. But another thing that was really helpful and very environmental was the development of the reclaimed water distribution system, which reclaims water processed through Scottsdale's water campus and distributes reclaimed water in order to water over 20 golf courses in the northern Scottsdale area. Some fun facts before we end. There have been several mining claims along the Pinnacle Peak area. None of them really turned out well, but the one that looks rather burned was found during the development of Desert Highlands, stuffed into an old Prince Albert tobacco can, and now is framed on the property of Desert Highlands. As I mentioned earlier, Raising Arizona was filmed not only in the old Ingebrigtsen Crescent Moon House, but also used the backdrop of Reata Pass along Alma School Road, and actually premiered at the old United Artists Studio Theater on Civic Center, now the building that houses the Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art. And maybe some of you will remember that there was a chapel on the grounds of Greasewood Flat where many people decided to have small weddings. And before any permanent churches were built in the greater Pinnacle Peak area, there was ecumenical worship led by Pastor Ann Cochran there for many years, again on the property of Greasewood Flat. So we've had many colorful characters that have lived in the greater Pinnacle Peak area. Harvey Noriega, who is the ranch manager for Brown's Ranch and DC Ranch. The founders of the greater Pinnacle Peak Homeowners Association, Ralph and Nancy Knight, who were so important in creating the community of Pinnacle Peak. And Florence Nelson, who not only with her husband Jerry helped develop that area, but she was known as the desert education lady and took examples of flora, fauna, and all the history of greater Pinnacle Peak area around to school children, and also had volunteers in the desert center there at the general store at Pinnacle Peak in Pima that hosted thousands of school children over the years to learn more about the greater Pinnacle Peak area. And we're always looking for more history. There are so many things that we don't have photos of or documents of. Here's a list of some. If any of you know of any of these, the library or the Historical Society would love to have these donated. So something else that I will, again, before we go to the Q&A session, that I'll draw your attention to is are the couple of books that I really recommend if you love this area history. Again, K.T. Palmer's book, For Land's Sake, is a wonderful one. Les Conklin, who for years led the Greater Pinnacle Peak Homeowners Association and was the publisher of Peak at the Peak, did an Arcadia book called Pinnacle Peak, which is wonderful pictures of the Pinnacle Peak area. There's a book about the Cavalier family that talks about the greater Pinnacle Peak area. And I did a book on the 25th anniversary of Desert Highlands that talks about that particular area. And there are some wonderful photos that were loaned to me in the coffee table book that I did in 2001 called Historic Scottsdale, A Life from the Land. So again, many ways for you to learn more about Pinnacle Peak history. And my advice to you all is it's your turn now to make a lot more Pinnacle Peak area history, because I'm eager to include it in my next talk about Pinnacle Peak. So I'm happy to take any questions.
So Joan, while you were talking to our group, there were a couple questions that came in that I was able to answer, like someone wanted recommendations for reading, which you were doing. So I said, hey, check it out. They're being made now. Looks like we have one question that's rolling in. Let me see. Name of first book, four. So we want the name of that first book, and it started out with 4. So.
Oh, yes. It's called For Land's Sake by K.T. Palmer. Again, it's been out of print for many years. I think it was published in 1976-ish. And again, it's K.T. Palmer, 1971 copyright. I think there's a copy that unfortunately it can't be checked out, but it's in the Scottsdale Heritage Connection room, the history room in the Civic Center library. KT also wrote a column in the old Arizonian newspapers that are all in that Scottsdale Heritage Connection room in bound copies. And that talks a lot about, in short little columns, about his life in the Pinnacle Peak area.
I've got another one for you. I may put you on the spot here, but are you familiar with the general store on the corner
Yes.
of Pinnacle Peak and Pima? And this individual wanted to know if you were aware if this had been a church at one time.
Gosh, it's been used for so many things. But gosh, a church. I know that as congregations started developing, they were using any available space in the greater Pinnacle Peak area, but I'm interested to know what church was there.
Yeah, if somebody
It was a
knows, let
restaurant.
us know. Yeah.
Even after Rancho Vista Bonita closed, Florence Nelson told me that there was some kind of zoning for the property that it had to always have a restaurant open. And there was a place called Sutphin's Barbecue that operated there. And I think that it also operated under another name. And then, of course, the general store, when it opened in about 1975, included and still includes a restaurant on the property.
Yeah, we love to have our breakfast there, that's for sure. Let's see, next question. We're wondering if there's been any modern rock slides on Pinnacle Peak or Troon Mountain. Are you aware of any modern rock slides?
Oh gosh. I know just before they opened Pinnacle Peak as a park, I accompanied a couple of city park staff as well as a geologist, Professor Stump from ASU, and that was one of the big concerns, is that they wanted, to really take a look at it before it opened to the public to see if there were any rocks that were in jeopardy. I personally don't know of any, but gosh, that is a good question. I feel pretty sure that unless we had some kind of seismic activity, that the city, I'm sure, is keeping really good tabs on both. And fortunately, that because there aren't any homes built on either Troon Mountain or on Pinnacle Peak, that fortunately no homes might be in danger. There aren't really any trails on Troon Mountain. Of course, there is the trail all the way to the top on Pinnacle Peak, but let's keep our fingers crossed that those rocks stay in place.
Absolutely. And then you had mentioned that there was a type of granite that the peak was comprised of or made of. What is that
Mhm.
granite called?
It's called Camelback coarse grained granite.
I wonder if
Camel,
you can find those in the stores when you want to put a countertop in your kitchen.
I don't know. I don't know. And I don't really know who gave it that name, but that comes from Professor Troy Payway's study about with the type of granite that it is. And of course, so many of our geographical features, as well as there's that there's a granite compositions of Camelback Mountain itself, and of the buttes on McDowell Road, and of course a lot of the features in the McDowells, as well as in the preserve, are made of different types of granite, but that particular one is Camelback coarse grained granite.
That's cool. So you touched a little bit on this, and maybe you can expound a little bit more, but we're wondering, where did the name Greasewood Flat come from? And also Reata Pass, where did that name come from?
Well, greasewood, of course, is a type of tree or bush that grows in the desert. And I think just because, that area was kind of a flat between the mountains, between Pinnacle Peak and the McDowell Mountains, and that just was something that Doc Cavalier, I know I did ask him the same question. And of
Yeah.
course, the greasewood, there was so much that they had to clear off that land as they were clearing it for what little construction was really necessary for greasewood. But that whole area was so wonderful too, because it was it wasn't real pretty during the day, and it really wasn't open much during the day. A few times they would open for special occasions for luncheons if a group was going to be in town. It was mainly an after dark place, and it looked so romantic during the dark in the dark. But in the daytime, Doc had just this amazing collection, almost rivaling Don Pablo's collection, but everything, all kinds of old ranch implements. And like I said, he recycled buildings from the old Thunderbird homes. That chapel that was on the property had actually come up on a truck that he had acquired in Mexico and then recreated on his property. So anyway, Greasewood and Reata Pass. Reata, of course, was the name of the lasso that cowboys used. And I might mention that Doc Cavalier and a lot of his brothers and other young men of Scottsdale were part-time cowboys on Brown's Ranch and DC Ranch, and Doc definitely was one of those part-time cowboys during his youth. And so I'm sure Reata was an important thing to him, because that's what they were doing to corral and lasso the cattle there. And again, it was a pass through the mountains, and
Yeah.
again used originally by the military going back and forth to Fort McDowell, but was a pass for stagecoaches and other transportation, and definitely used by the cowboys going from the upper Browns Ranch to the lower DC Ranch during the Browns Ranch the era. So again, Reata being the cowboy lasso, and pass being that pass through the mountains.
Great. Also, we are wondering what kind of minerals were the claims and mines for?
A little silver, a little copper. Nothing really kind of panned out. There are a couple of abandoned mines within the McDowells, definitely off the beaten track, because they don't want anybody to, to hurt themselves in that. One's called the Dixie Mine. I think there's a Paradise Mine. K.T. Palmer filed a claim or two. And like I said, there was that one that they found the claim in the old tobacco tin when they were building Desert Highlands, but really none of the claims really amounted to much. They might have gotten a little bit out of it. The only real successful mining was done up more in the Cave Creek area, where they found a bit more silver, maybe a little bit of gold, maybe a little bit of copper.
Awesome. Okay, and then we are wondering if you can give us some resources to trace the old Stoneman Road.
Again, if you Google it, there are also, I believe, on this, if you go to scottsdalelibrary.org, the Scottsdale Public Library, they have an absolutely amazing digital collection. And I believe among the digital collection, if you search, once you are on the library's website, Stoneman Road, I believe that there are the documents that the past finders of the McDowell-Sonoran Conservancy, they've uploaded those. I might mention that also nearly all of the hard copies of the old Peek at the Peak magazine that was it started out as the homeowners newsletter for the Pinnacle Peak Homeowners Association, but then developed into a monthly full-fledged magazine with great historical features. Those were all scanned, and those are on the library's website. And then there was an organization that was more of a political action committee called the COP, Citizens of Pinnacle all of a sudden it's escaping me what COP stood for, but their newsletters are also on the library's website, as well as a number of the photos that were in my PowerPoint. So the library's website, which is a collaboration between the Scottsdale Public Library System and the Scottsdale Historical Society, has over 10,000 digital photographs, oral history, interviews, either videoed or sound, many documents, A couple of the archaeological studies of the early Hohokam villages are also either online or physically, if they couldn't be scanned. They're in the that Scottsdale Heritage Connection Center there at the Civic Center Library. So there are so many resource opportunities to find out more information about all of these kind of side areas of the greater Pinnacle Peak area and of Scottsdale itself.
So I have kind of a question that is not really related to your presentation, but it's come up a few times. And if you're not prepared to answer it, I certainly will after with our viewers, but we have a couple people that are interested to know who owns the property around Pinnacle Peak and Pima Road. And I believe it's Henry Becker.
It is.
Yeah, and if you know anything about that, if you wanted to share, that's great. If not, I've asked them
You
to
know,
be.
I don't know
Yeah,
the gentleman personally. I know,
yeah,
gosh, years ago he ran for city council unsuccessfully. And I know that just because I lived in that area, I live in Greyhawk now, but I lived in
yeah,
Troon during the time that he put up a lot of the signs and had that trailer parked on the
yes.
corner. It went up in June of 2001 because I remember I was out of town for a week or two. And when I came back from being out of town, that's how long a lot of those signs and structures that he put on the corner. But really, I don't know anything about that property other than what I've read in the media.
Right,
And
and they can find that too. Just do an
yeah,
internet search for Henry Becker, Pinnacle Peak
and
Development.
really, I mean, I don't
Yeah,
even know if he's still the current owner. I know at the time
absolutely.
when a
Yeah.
lot of that went up, that he was. And again, I know um,
I know that a
that,
lot of those wood structures were being moved a while back with the Pima Road
right.
improvement, so I'm not really
Yes.
sure how that all
Hmm.
played out, but anybody that really wants to know can do an internet search
Hmm.
for sure. We have a few more questions and then we'll wrap it up because we're
Okay.
coming down to the wire here. We've got some accolades for you. They much appreciate your presentation. Wondering if Doc Cavalier is still alive.
No, he passed away. Gosh, I have his obituary here. Let's see. He passed away in, all right, Joan, where is it? 2009, September 19th, 2009. He was born in Scottsdale in September 1916. And a great picture of him.
Yeah.
And he always held court, of course, in the bar at either Greasewood Flat or Reata Pass. And what a wonderful man. I mean, he had such an interesting history. In addition to being a part-time cowboy at Brown's Ranch, and also the part-time water well digger. He also served as a caddy when we Scottsdale's first golf course, the Ingleside Inn, which is now kind of the land underneath where the Arizona Country Club golf course is. He served in World War II. When he came back, the his father's blacksmith shop really wasn't being needed by the late 1940s to shoe horses or do farm implements anymore. So George Doc helped kind of transition the Cavaliers blacksmith shop into an ornamental ironwork. And he became part of that Arizona craftsman movement. And gosh, Frank Lloyd Wright hired him to create that really interesting logo or the Frank Lloyd Wright designed the logo, but George, formed it for the signage and many of the signs that lead to Frank Lloyd Wright and Taliesin West, and did a lot of work for local resorts and whatnot, creating ornamental ironwork. He served at least one term on the town council. And like I said, he and his family, his sister Dorothy Cavalier was a parachute rigger at Thunderbird Field during World War II. And she also was a longtime early clerk of the town of Scottsdale. And Anyway, what a wonderful family. Brothers and sisters were so involved in all kinds of things and in building our entire community.
Okay, I've got one last question for you, and I'm going to touch on a couple things that I'm seeing here on the screen. What I want to preface with is I cannot guarantee that this information is 100% accurate. So I'm just sharing what our viewers are sharing with us. And I think what they're trying to tell me is that that property is owned by the Coalition of Pinnacle Peak. I've seen it showing up twice.
Hmm.
So
You
that's what
mean
I'm thinking.
you mean
The
the northeast corner of Pinnacle Peak and Pima?
That's right.
Oh,
That's what I think they're
Coalition of
responding to.
Pinnacle Peak.
So I'm
That's what I was
I'm
trying to
telling the group
remember.
I couldn't guarantee that's 100%
Hmm.
accurate, but that's what we're
Hmm.
hearing from our viewers. Also, we're hearing that Henry Becker has passed away,
Hmm.
and that they're not sure how the property is transferred or how that is all gone. Another accolade for you, just loving what you're doing, and thank you. And um, let's see.
Back to Henry
This,
Becker. I've been told by people that know him that he was also very generous. I think
yeah.
he donated the rest of his campaign funds to the Boys and Girls Club, and that he also, uh, was very concerned about, his adopted town of Scottsdale. So he
Right.
joined so many others in the greater Pinnacle Peak area as a memorable person.
And clarification here, and I apologize, it's hard when you get little short snippets in these questions, but it says Coalition of Pinnacle Peak, not Henry Becker's land.
Hmm.
So, and that's what I thought we were trying to share, but
Hmm.
reiterating that from another person. And then one last question. Wait. Was John Wayne's movie Stagecoach filmed at Reata Pass?
I've heard that and I've tried to track that down, and I wish that somebody could give me some more definitive proof. I know there were a couple of other movies that filmed in that area. In fact, Waiting to Exhale had a scene, I think it's where one of the stars is throwing her husband's clothes out into the driveway, and that was a home in the Troon area.
Oh,
So that had at least one scene from the greater Pinnacle Peak area. But I think there were at least one or two other cowboy movies that were filmed in that area. But I wish that somebody would give me some proof
yeah.
so I could include that in my next Pinnacle Peak talk.
All right, last question, and then we'll wrap things up. Is there anything of archaeological significance at the corner of Happy Valley and 115th Street? About 20 years ago, it was roped off for researchers and is still undeveloped.
Well, all I can tell you is that when I first started, when I was doing that book, Historic Scottsdale, A Life from the Land, and met with some archaeologists, they said, we'll tell you what's been in the greater Pinnacle Peak area, and particularly in that area of Desert Crest and the community across the street from that. But you have to promise not to put the exact location in the book or in any printed materials. And so it's kind of been an unwritten thing among historians and whatnot not to publish the exact locations because uh, to my understanding there still are some pottery shards and perhaps some other artifacts, and it was declared a permanent part of NAOS, or open natural open space, so that that land would not be discovered or would be disturbed by anyone. So it is in the greater Pinnacle Peak area, and there still are probably some artifacts or pieces of artifacts, but I beg you, let let them lie and
Yes,
let them be in their natural state,
yeah.
and let us remember them. Again, if you're really interested in that, there are some archaeological studies that are again available in that Scottsdale Heritage Connection room that talk a little bit more about those studies that were done in the 80s and 90s about not just at Pinnacle Peak, but also at Browns Mountain, and very interesting. And that may pinpoint it a little bit more, but uh, I'm not going to tell you where they are.
All
I was
right.
honor bound.
Yes. If you told us, you'd have to kill us. Isn't that what they say, or something like
Yeah,
that? I don't know.
I
No,
disavow all knowledge.
I'm just kidding, gang. So, with that, we'd like to bring closure. Joan, we just had such a great time with your stories and your information and history, and you're always such a jewel to be with, and we appreciate you. There were more accolades that rolled in that I
No,
didn't share, and
well,
so I
thank
want
you.
you to know that there were more of those. And yeah, we'll see you on December 11th for your Thunderbird presentation.
Well,
And
thank you. And
yeah,
again, if there were any mistakes, I'll take full blame for that. And I'm always anxious to get more stories. So if I didn't cover a story that you liked, let me know.
and with that, go out and enjoy this beautiful day. And thank you for joining us today and for visiting with Joan. Take care.
Bye.